Now we have a panel led by Anna Dutra, who is the head of the Executives Club of Chicago, with a very impressive group of people. Anna will be introducing her guests individually, but I just wanted to join me, please, in welcoming Anna Dutra, Dee Robinson, Sarah Alter, Terry Savage, and Wendy Davidson. Come on up.
To sit next to her.
Oh.
Nobody wants to be close.
No.
That's just not a good start.
Shuffle.
Well,
nice to see you.
First of all, I'm Anna Dutra, and I'm the CEO of the Executives Club, as Sarah mentioned. I want to just thank Accenture and all of you for being here today. This is a wonderful event, and I hope that each and every one of you who are in this room don't keep it only to yourselves. As you go back to your teams, to your organizations, share all the inspiration that these women are going to share with you in this room. So thank you very much. Let me introduce myself and then our panelists, although you have in your apps, you have our bios. I'm now the CEO of the Executives Club, but I have spent my career, and I'm born and raised in Brazil, so I am an immigrant now, a self-defined immigrant, which is something that I never did until 2 years ago, leading businesses in technology and in consulting. And I'm a very proud Accenture alum. So 14 years ago, when we have this first event, I was actually a partner with Accenture. And now even more so, because when we get to the point when one of our children is picking the place that's going to be her first full-time job, and one of the options is a company you worked for, and you say, that's where you gotta go. You really love the place. So my daughter is now with Accenture, and I'm very nervous because she's somewhere in this room. But let me start with introducing our panel. And these are all trailblazers, wonderful women who were the first female in their careers in many areas. You're going to see that. But more than that, they blaze the trails for others as well. So I know each and every one of them. They are mentors, they are sponsors, and we're going to talk about the difference between those. So let me start with Wendy Davidson. So Wendy is the president of U.S. Specialty Channels for Kellogg's, and she's been in that role for 5 years now, and that's a $1.5 billion division in the company. She has spent her career in the food business, so previously she was with McCormick & Company, where she founded the very first Women's International Network within the organization. And prior to that, she spent 16 years with Tyson Foods. Wendy serves in a number of non-for-profit boards and is active in a number of women executive organizations. And finally, just last year, she was awarded the National Diversity Council's Top 15 Business Women in Illinois. So thank you for joining us. Now, my dear friend, Dee Robinson, she is the ultimate entrepreneur, right? And while you may not have heard the name of her company, she's the founder and CEO of Robinson Hill, they manage a number of the concessions in airports that all of us, especially the ones who are consultants, have been to. So as you go to a Ben & Jerry and Einstein Brothers, Potbelly, Hudson News, Frontier Grill, Choco Intelligentsia, Dee is behind that. So all the yummy stuff that not necessarily is great for us, but we love you in any case. And before that, Dee has had a great career in advertising. So she was a partner with Leo Burnett, and she's involved with a number of non-for-profit and for-profit boards, including Wintrust. But above everything, she is a phenomenal mentor of women and a mother of a young woman as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you. Well, Terry Savage needs no introduction, right? So Terry is one of those, we're going to talk about that, who was many firsts, including first female in a couple of boards, McDonald's and Pennzoil. She was also the first female trader in the Chicago Board of Trade, right? So we gotta get there. And she's a nationally recognized expert on personal finance, the economy, and the markets. She writes a weekly personal finance column syndicated in major newspapers and appears often at the Huffington Post, Forbes, and CNN. So most of you may know Terry for her bestseller, The Savage Truth on Money. But she actually has another book that I like even better, and I'll recommend to all the women thinking about getting in or out of relationships in the room, and that's The New Love Deal. Everything you must know before marrying, moving in, or moving on.
I have co-authors.
So thank you for joining us, Terry. And then last but not least, Sarah Alter. So Sarah not only is a newly minted CEO, so she's been on the job for less than a year with the network of executive women, but also before that, she has had a fabulous career in corporate, in financial services, in real estate, and in other companies as well. So 7 years at Discover, and then with Quill.com, where she was the first VP of digital. So did that role even exist before you? No. Why am I not surprised? And then lastly, the Chief Marketing Officer for General Growth Properties. So Sarah is involved with a number of women organizations, and so voila, she now leads one. So we're going to talk a little bit about transitioning from corporate to non-for-profit. So before we even start, please give these women a round of applause. Well, I started with the stuff that we can actually read in their bios, right? But now I want to do a round robin and tell us a couple of things that is not in your bio and the one word that defines you.
The one word that would define me, if I had to pick one, would be purpose. I intend to be purposeful in the things that I do, but I often describe myself as passionate and perky with a purpose, because I also think that there's an opportunity to bring joy to the people around you and to bring your passions every day. So things that I would say you wouldn't read in my bio. I trained for and ran in the Chicago Marathon 2 years ago. It was on my bucket list. In 2009, I took a year sabbatical between two companies, and I created a bucket list of items that I wanted to do to challenge myself and really build personal muscle rather than professional muscle. And that was the year I went skydiving, and I trained for a couple of races and things like that. All things that if you knew me, you would know. I'm afraid of heights. I don't run unless I'm chased. Try not to sweat. So all of those are things that were personal risks.
Thank you. Dee.
Well, I would say determined. And as you know, I'm an entrepreneur. And we quickly learned that a lot of people will tell us no. But for me, no means maybe. Maybe means yes. And many of the things that we've done, I have to tell you, I was rejected, whether it was the very first retail store. Sears didn't think they wanted to have this concept, and I'm pretty relentless about making calls. I was determined to get to this guy. I called him every single day, actually every other day, but it was in the morning, the afternoon, and I got him one night at 7 p.m. The gatekeeper had left because I was determined. I knew he was a decision maker, and I was determined to get to him, and that led to our first retail venture with Sears, and then even getting into the airport concessions business. I also got a rejection letter. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, wait, they said no? But it was a great thing because no actually gives you an opportunity to learn. And in this case, I actually wanted my first Ben & Jerry's franchise, and they said no. But I convinced them they needed to be in Chicago, and we now have several. And there was no to the airports, but no, again, gives you an opportunity to learn, but determined.
All right. My word would be, I think, persistent. I remember someone asked me about this years back, and I said, I remember as a child, my father saying to me, "Can't you take no for an answer?" And I went, "No." And, I was lost in thought of what you were saying, because probably that's along the same line. I've always been persistent. I should correct something. The New Love Deal, which is a great book, I co-authored with two fabulous women in Chicago, Gemma Allen, your divorce attorney if you need one, and the Honorable Judge. Okay, there you go. True story. And the Honorable Judge Michelle Lawrence, who just retired from the divorce court bar judgeship after 20 years and is now a mediator, so that if you don't read our book in the first place, you want to go to Michelle to mediate your divorce. Okay. What else did you ask me to tell you?
I think we're good. We're going to get there.
Here's what would surprise you. You said something about what would surprise you about me. So when I'm not in the persona of Terry the money lady, I don't think I've ever said this out loud, but now I'm enjoying it. You will find me riding one of my 4 horses, 1 in Florida and 3 up in Wisconsin, and I become a totally different person with no makeup. You would not recognize me at all, and it's the thing I most love to do outside of my work.
Thank you, Sarah.
Well, it's a trade-off between 2 words. My first term that came to mind was equality. And my current role today is the perfect role to have, because it's all about creating equality for all. But then the second was inspiration. So I want to be a source of inspiration for others. I would say the one thing you probably don't know about me, I graduated with a degree in economics, but my very first job out of college, I was a truck dispatcher. So I've had an interesting career journey, going from truck dispatcher to CEO of a not-for-profit. But what I loved about this job at that time, I wanted to go into sales more than anything, and there were no sales roles open. And so my boss said, "Well, learn the business, and you'll ultimately be a better salesperson at the end of the day." And so I took this job, and it taught me humility, it taught me hard work, and it really taught me how to appreciate others, and that others needed to all be treated equally.
Thank you. So the topic of this conference is getting to equal, right? And by the way, for the men in the room, there's no battle of the sexes here. We just want to talk and do something about getting to equal. But let's remind ourselves how much progress we made. I always tell the story when I was little in Brazil, a great aunt of mine wanted to work. There was just one problem. Women could not take a job without the husband authorizing her to. And her husband was MIA. He had left. Not that she wanted him back, but she couldn't take the job because technically she was still married. And she had to advertise his search in newspapers for 3 weeks before they could give her the job. So the bottom line is that we made a lot of progress. There's still a ton of ways to go, but we made progress. So as you think about where we are now, and when you started your careers, can you share with the audience an area where you know we made progress and what you think prompted that? So, for example, when I started in consulting, we could not wear pantsuits. I was actually sent back home because I showed up in a pantsuit. Or we did not have working from home arrangements. So, Wendy, as you started your career in the food business, what were some things that did not exist, that exist now, and that helped us to get to equal?
Well, and I did have an experience prior to Tyson. I was a buyer for Von Maur, and we had very specific rules. I could relate to the earlier speaker that we had to wear skirts. They had to be a certain length. We had to wear heels. You weren't allowed to wear flats. You absolutely couldn't have a naked leg. You needed to wear hose. All of it felt very constricting. I left Von Maur, and when I started with Tyson, the complete opposite. A very male-dominated Southern company, wonderful people, but we wore khaki shirts with the logo on one side, our name stitched on the other. It sort of resembled the UPS driver. And I was in sales, and so you always wore pants. You went from looking very female to very male. And our culture wasn't such that it really encouraged men and women to be authentic to themselves. So I was the only female on the team. I did find myself at a point where my personal life was very much kept in the background. My husband also worked at the company. And the things that have changed since then, I find myself now always wearing skirts for the most part. So I've sort of embraced the femininity. But we have mothers' rooms. I remember the time when we put in place the first nursing rooms at corporate headquarters. And I actually had some of the men on the executive team who said, I don't understand why we're converting these rooms. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, here's what happened. I came back to the office from maternity leave, and I had an office. So I could pump in my office, but I had to store my milk in the refrigerator on the main floor with a Post-it that said, please don't use for your coffee. I need this for breakfast tomorrow morning for someone else. But I had the privacy of my office. I went into the restroom, and there were multiple women who were in cubicles, but were pumping in the restroom. And it occurred to me, if you're making lunch or dinner for your child in the bathroom, because we've not provided an environment where you can otherwise do it. If I don't have a place to store my milk during the day, there were all those nuances. So where we are today, we sort of embrace mothers and fathers being equally involved in their kids' lives. My husband is now a stay-at-home dad. When we went from Tyson to McCormick, we knew we were going to be in Baltimore. We had no family around. And so he said, I'm going to stay home for a couple of years. And then when we moved here to Chicago, he said, I think this is where I'm meant to be, and you're where you're meant to be, and you can be your best self if I do this. All of that has changed sort of the dynamics. What I think needs to happen still is for it to be more receptive for men to be at home. He still faces the stigma of people asking him, what do you do all day? And there's sort of this implication that he's on Netflix all day long and has nothing else going on. And so he's getting the reverse discrimination of being stay-at-home that lots of moms used to get about what do you do all day while your husband's at work. So I think there's progress made, progress yet to be made.
I want to go back to what Sarah had said earlier about the difference between like diversity and inclusion. You know, diversity is getting invited to the party. You know, inclusion is getting asked to dance. And we had the pleasure of doing a recent research study in partnership with Accenture, as well as Mercer. And what the research showed in CPG and retail sectors is that companies have done a good job inviting everybody to the party. Right? Like we're seeing equal levels of recruiting and of promotion. But then when it comes to getting invited to that private salon dance, which is that executive level, that's where it all falls apart. And so I think that companies have done a really great job focusing on diversity, but they've neglected to create that right culture that begets that inclusion, that allows women and diverse leaders to be successful. And in fact, our stats even show that when you get to that C-suite level in CPG and retail, you see women leaving at a rate of like 27%, and men are leaving at a rate of 7%. And if you don't course correct that 10 years from now, women will be leaving at a rate of 50%. Oh, wow. So it's an equal focus on diversity as well as an equal focus on that conscious inclusion. I think that's where the progress has been made, but more to be had.
So let's put the elephant on the table, right? Me Too and Time's Up. It's appalling how many strong, influential, well-known women stayed quiet for too long. And so we have the Me Too and the not me, right? I don't want to be the first one. And as soon as somebody comes out, and for those of you who saw the Oscar ceremony last week, there was that Frances McDermott moment when she asked women to stand up, and they were all looking at each other. And to me, it was not even what she subsequently said was the fact that she looked at Meryl Streep and said, Mary, come on, if you stand up, everybody will. And then everybody stood up. So, Terry, I've seen you standing up first in some issues, and I've seen you pulling back. Can you give, along the course of your career, an example where you saw one woman standing up making all the difference in the world, and everybody else then joining, and we had the conversation about feminism.
Well, you know,
come on,
I come from a generation of women that stood up at odd times. You asked about perspective. Think about this. In maybe 16 months, we are going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, August 18th, 1920. I mean, really? 100 years ago. Now let me give you some perspective. I thought, am I going to say this? And I am. This year marks the 50th anniversary that I, as a college graduate with a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, needed a job to earn some extra money before I went off to grad school, and answered an ad that said, Secretary, light typing, no shorthand, prestige LaSalle Street brokerage firm. In fact, I just took out to dinner the man who hired me and mentored me 50 years ago. The job paid $100 a week. I noticed that there were a bunch of young men marching through with some regularity. They were attending the training classes to be brokers. I said, I want to be a broker. I was forgetting about graduate school. I never actually did use the fellowship. I really was caught up by the markets. They said, oh no, girls can't be brokers, but if you take the correspondence course and pass the test, we'll give you a raise to $105 a week. And I did. I got a great education because I went to every department, the trading department, the bond department, the research department. And I passed the test. And then I said, you know, they said, you have to go into the managing partner. I said, just give me a phone and a desk. I'll cost you less than all these men. The man who mentored me was John Buckingham Elliott, the Buckingham Fountain, that family. And that started my career as a broker, which went on to be the first woman on the CBOE. But we're talking about not my lifetime, 100 years ago, not yet, for getting the vote. 50 years ago, women could not be anything but secretaries and clerks in banks. Women employed, Ann Ladke, bless her, they marched on the Harris Bank that women should get to be something more than just bank tellers. Women could be nurses, not doctors. Law secretaries, but not lawyers. We have come a long, long way, baby. We should appreciate that, how far we've come, and yet, as you point out, how much farther we have to go. I come from a generation, every one of us has first women things. First woman in Rotary, that was a big deal. I said, why do you want to hear me speak every year and you won't make me a member? No, really. So, Me Too is a separate, before you get on to Me Too about the harassment that inevitably happened, we could each tell you stories. The most important thing is to realize we have such great momentum, and I understand the Me Too moment better than many, believe me. But I don't want the Me Too moment to turn into a pity party for ourselves. Right. We got through all that, and so will you, if we just keep pushing forward. I'm glad we're recognizing it, but let's not get buried in it.
Thank you, Dee.
Yeah. I want to talk a moment about bravery, because actually, first of all, there's a bunch of brave women here, also in the audience, but when you think about decisions we have to make, Danny talked about checking the boxes, but she also talked about her sponsor. And we hear a lot about men being sponsors. And the research actually shows that a lot of women that have advanced is because of a man. Now, the research also shows that women are also reluctant. I want us to be brave, because the problem is they're afraid that they're going to stand out. They're going to make a decision that's wrong. Mm-hmm. They're afraid that someone's going to say that you're favoring the other woman. You're favoring the African American woman. You're favoring the Asian woman. We have to stop that. And actually, the opportunity truly is when we step up and be brave and understand that we should be the change we want to see. take that opportunity when you see a young woman struggling, and they talked about the need for networks in our companies and all of that. Look out there and see who you can actually reach out to and bring up. And I'm going to share with you just quickly my corporate career. I've went to Johnson & Johnson, worked there, Leo Burnett. And we talked about the research as well. African American women are leaving the corporate workforce at greater numbers. Many women are leaving to go start their families, but frankly, they're just leaving because they're fed up. Danny had great elephant skin. Does that tell you most people would not have been able to endure the beat up? Simply because, first of all, they were not beating them up to sort of say, you know what, no, there's greatness in you. They were beating them up because, you know what, you're here, I don't necessarily want you. And that message is strong. And for me, when I decided to leave my corporate job, I said enough. You know, I was working so hard, and I said, you know, I also didn't want someone to have that kind of control over my future. And it was that moment when, by the way, my mother thought I lost my mind. She just did. I'm leaving a corporate job, you know, you're going to get that pension down the road. But I ended up leaving, learning that stepping out and just doing what my heart said was right. But we can also do that within our corporate environments as well.
Thank you. And one thing that Dee said that is very important, and if there's one thing you leave with today, don't confuse mentors and sponsors, right? And I'll steal this from you, James. Your mentors are the people who are there to ask you questions, to give advice, to open the doors. Your sponsors get you through the door. These are the people who, when there's only one person to be promoted, there's only one slot, and that person has clout and is in the room, that person will pound the table and say, she is the one who goes through. But, you know, as women,
You know that.
and many times in our careers, over the course of our careers, we feel that, hey, maybe I'm not senior enough to make this comment or to speak up. So I'll ask this to you, Wendy, because you had an incredible corporate career. Are there behaviors that you realized you changed in the meeting rooms, in the room, once you became more senior? Things that in the beginning of your career, you said, maybe I don't want to stick my neck out on this one, but how have your behaviors changed, and how do you apply that in the teams that you lead now?
Well, I guess I would relate a bit to what Danny said earlier. And I was asked a couple of years ago on a panel, at what moment in your life did you realize that you were different? Mm-hmm. It was a panel of all women, and we were asked that sort of moment when you felt different than the people around you. And I couldn't relate to the stories that the women were telling. My father ran HR for a large company. He would bring executive candidates to our home, and we would have dinner with them. And he encouraged my brother and I to read the front page of the paper every night before dinner, because we were encouraged to have an opinion and to debate, but we needed to have an educated and informed opinion. And I took that, and then with these largely white men, older men who were at the table debating current day events with our family, I was really young. I was probably 8 or 9 years old. That my age and my gender and my experience didn't limit my ability to have an opinion and to have a seat at the table. That formed a lot of how I think I entered the workforce and gave me a voice in largely male-dominated rooms and companies, because I didn't know that my voice wasn't valued. I didn't know I didn't have a voice. It probably made me a bit more brave than maybe my experience certainly would warrant, but I felt like I needed to use my seat at the table. I now encourage lots of both men and women, and especially young people in the organization, not to wait until they're at an executive level to use their voice and use their influence. But I also think as executives, our job is to tap into the organization and give those folks an opportunity to engage in bigger business questions. We have a saying within Kellogg's that cornflakes enter the building, and by the time they get to the top, they become Frosted Flakes. And And as executives, that's often what happens. We get this sort of glossed over, sugary version of the truth. But if you really reach down into the organization, you get to that soft, nuggety middle where all the problems are, but also the real solutions to move the business forward. We have to have the courage to reach down, but people entering the workforce need to have the courage to step up and speak up.
So you talked about leading with courage, right? So I'll ask this question to Terry, because I have seen her very strategically leading with courage and speaking up, but also leading with grace and pulling back, and sometimes even telling me from across the room.
Well,
so when do you choose, and how do you make that choice? Because it always works.
Anna and I serve in a number of capacities together, but I started out in a man's world, but just defying it. And being an independent contractor like a broker or a trader, you really don't have to defer to anybody. And that was pretty good because I'm not very deferential ever. I was really proud, just to digress about the story about McDonald's. I was the first woman on the board of directors of McDonald's. And I was on the board for 12 years, starting in 1989. And nobody told me how to be a board member, but someone did pull me aside before the first meeting and said, I'm going to give you one word of advice. Don't bring up salads. I said, this is true. I said, what? Well, because you're a woman, they think you're going to want to add salads to the menu. It's a big controversial thing, so don't be the champion of salads.
And then you called Dee and she added Ben & Jerry's, right?
I've been in those situations. At McDonald's, we talked about networks briefly and about the companies that don't have networks. Well, I think that's so important. McDonald's already had a women operators network and women's leadership network. I knew I was a director with responsibility to all the shareholders and employees, but I, at that time, felt a special role for women and started a summer party up at my house in Wisconsin that ultimately grew to them bringing busloads of women up. I mean, we had 150, 160 women, and I would be driving the pontoon boat around the lake, getting thrilled to say, people that didn't know each other in this big company saying, oh, you're Jane. I talked to you in purchasing. Oh, I didn't know you were the woman who headed accounting. I think that networks serve the function of cross-dimensionally within a corporation, letting accomplished women meet each other and support each other. And okay, that's 25 years ago, but I still think that women tend to get marginalized. You asked me about when to stand up. That's some of the lessons I've had to learn the hard way. I've never regretted anything I've said, but I've also learned that when you're playing in the boys' sandbox, it's an awful like what they were like in third grade, picking teams for baseball. They behave the same way when they're 60 years old and in a boardroom. And I've learned when discretion is a better part of valor, and I think I've gained a lot of maturity and perspective on that. But I still never, ever, ever will chicken out of saying or doing what I believe to be the right thing. And I think your conscience is your guide. Discretion is wise, but you should never, ever compromise your integrity. And if you're not willing to stand up and be counted, then you shouldn't be in the room. That's how I've played it.
Sarah, in your new role, you see women executives or in the pipeline in a number of different industry segments, functions. Are there industry segments where getting to equal is still harder than others, or is it a playing field at this point?
Yeah, no, I would say it doesn't matter. You know, the same opportunity exists across the sectors, and the challenge arises, like I'd referenced earlier. It's not at that entry point. It's not at that junior to mid-level of management or leadership opportunity. It's when you broach that C-suite, that executive level. And that's where, obviously, you start to look around you, and somebody said it earlier, where you're like 1 out of 10, if you're lucky. And that's where what we've seen in all of our research and partnership with all of our members is that that's where women are feeling isolated. They don't feel like they belong. They don't necessarily have the sponsor or the network to support them and guide them through. And I think that really it's a common theme that we see across the sectors.
So on that topic, Dee and Wendy, how do you ask for a well-deserved raise or promotion? Teach them.
Well, right now I'm paying myself. Well, it's interesting, actually. I have women and men who will come to me and ask for a raise. And we're a meritocracy. We're, just because you've been with Robinson Hill for a number of years, frankly, I'm thrilled that you're on our team. But, everything that we do, and as women in particular, we have to add value. And so I want you to come and say what I've accomplished. And at the end of the day, this discussion really is about economics in many ways, because if we figure out what value we can bring to any corporation, they're going to figure out a way to keep us. But unfortunately, sometimes they don't see that value. You've got to also share and tell the story. So but to the question, make sure you're going there and telling them what you've accomplished, how you've moved the dial, how you help the bottom line. Remember, this is really, truly about economics. The D&I always talk about the big I being the inclusion, but then I think about the big P, which is profitability, and that's what DI equals P in my mind means. And so I would say if you know that you've done something great, also what's important. What you've done must align with what their goals are, what the vision of the company is. You got to let them know that you are part of moving the dial in some way. But I believe wholeheartedly, I've been here so many years, and so-and-so got promoted. It's not about anyone else but you.
So it's make a case for action. Sarah and then Wendy.
Yeah. So if I may, I need to tell a humorous anecdote. I immediately thought of it when you asked this question. I have a good friend who's a senior exec in HR, and they had just conducted a review and given a performance rating and then a raise to a younger, newer generation employee. And later that day, she gets a phone call, and it's the parents of that employee. And the parents called back and shared their dismay with the rating and the level of raise. So you got to just have your parents call. That's how you get your raise.
And then what happened?
It floored me.
Oh my God.
I know. I'm not doing that, and I can assure you guys aren't doing that either.
Parents.
Yeah. My kids got to get their own raise.
Though, I talked earlier about being brave. We also just have to believe that we can step up there and ask. People will just say, "I'm not going to do this. I'm afraid to go and ask for it." And they're telling everybody in the company, other than the people that matter, that they need a raise or they're entitled. And it's easy for us to get with our friends or other colleagues to just say all the things that we've done. Your voice needs to be there with decision makers. And I want to speak to this point about how we think. It was just last week at an EO member meeting, is Entrepreneurs Organization. And there's some incredible women in the room. And we're talking about getting on corporate boards. We all have this interest in getting on more boards. And she was literally, by the way, one of the smartest women I know. And she was sitting there telling me, well, I don't know if I deserve this. She's literally telling me all the things why. Well, so-and-so, I guess she has a friend who's was successful at getting a board seat. But she was just telling me, well, I don't know if I can do this. And then I'm saying, are you kidding me? You're managing a large corporate fund. You have these achievements. She's 40. But I was just listening to her telling herself and me why she didn't think she was deserving. And as I sit on boards, I will tell you that she's probably stronger, better, and more qualified than a good number of the board members. And I had to stop her and say, why not? But we do this. We will close doors before they open, all because we're telling ourselves we're not entitled.
Okay, there's one of the world's great motivational records from the 1950s when young men were training to be salesmen. Well, first of all, you must read Success Through a Positive Mental Attitude, W. Clement Stone's book. I must have read that 5 times over. Okay. That, I mean, you have to take out the part about that's all male, okay, and get a left. But you have to read that. And then one of the greatest motivational recordings ever is The World's Strangest Secret, which came back in a weird way a few years ago. But the secret is you become what you think you are.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'm absolutely sure that 90%, I mean, aside from being qualified, 90% of the extra ingredient that separates us from our most best selves is a belief in yourself, is seeing yourself in that job, in that role. Even if you're BSing yourself, you start to believe it. And once you believe it and see yourself there, it's just amazing how the seas part and you walk right up and get your seat at the table. It's all in your belief in yourself. I don't know how you talk yourself into that, but read those 2 books and you'll have a good start.
And she's right, though. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay,
fake it
Sarah.
till you make it, right? It's the best advice I've ever been given. Fake it till you make it.
But men and women think differently about that space.
Yeah.
A man, I don't really care. Men, thank you for being here today. But I'm going to talk to the ladies just for a moment. Because men may not be completely, I mean, they just want something. And they may not have all the credentials, but they decide I want it. And you know what? They're going to go after it. You know, they're just going to step out there. They're going to feel entitled or whatever it is. We, on the other hand, ladies, sometimes say, well, I don't think so. And again, you shut down the opportunity. And Terry, you're so right. And I always say it's about,
example of it, the best.
oh, you're kind, but it's about how we think.
So,
And even if you don't think that you are already, so what? Just go give it a shot. But there's the law of intention, the law of attraction.
I do think it's important to almost think of yourself as a product. So anybody that's in sales or ever had to sell anything, if you're going in to ask for something, anything, you have to take the emotion out of it. I think that's the worst thing is when you go in and you compare yourself to somebody else, or it's the I feel like I'm undervalued. As soon as you become emotional about it or make it an emotional argument, it's not an argument. When it becomes something that is factual, it's the features and benefits. It's about results. If you deliver results and you can make that business case for what have I done, what value has it driven for the organization, always important to say, here's what I have done, and here's the value it has done to the company, and here's what more I think I can do, then it's a lot easier to ask for something more. I also challenge people to not really be limited by the boxes on the org chart. I've never viewed my career aspirations to be a title or a particular box on the org chart, but I want to have autonomy, I want to have authority, and I want to have impact. But I also want people in the organization who want the same thing. In the time I was at Tyson, I was there almost 17 years. I had 9 different roles. Half of those roles were newly created. And they were created because I went in with and I didn't ask for a new role, but I went in with I think we could do this, and I think it could do this for the company. And then it all ultimately would become, oh, that's a great idea, Wendy, why don't you go do that? So I do think if you keep it related to you are a product, you're selling yourself as a product, and it's based on the benefit you will drive for the organization, it's a lot easier to make the argument.
so the bottom line for asking for promotions and raises, build your own business case. Do not compare yourself to your peers, and do not call your parents to call your boss either. Fake it till you make it, and a little dose of confidence. And you know, now I'm going to talk a little bit to the younger women in the room, because I think that's easier said than done, and easier for us to say that at this point. But if you read the book, The Imposter Syndrome by Valerie Young, the imposter syndrome still is mostly a women's syndrome, right? So there is a difference between getting to equal and truly, truly feeling equal. And so many times we have that nasty roommate in our heads, as Arianna Huffington puts it, saying, you know what, it was a fluke, or you just fooled them again. When you had that in your minds, and anybody can jump in, what do you do, right? I know I talk to myself in the mirror. I actually have a conversation and straighten myself up if I am self-doubting. What do you guys do? What's your tip, your personal response?
I went and actually, I wrote a resume for myself. Very detailed. I went back to the first job I had in high school. I was actually a McDonald's crew member. And prior to that, I think I walked beans and tasseled corn. So I feel very related to the people who've spoken earlier. But I went back to every job, but also every project that I worked on, even in high school or in college, and what were the things that I did well and what were the things I didn't do well. That became a narrative that could play in the loop in my head, because otherwise the loop that plays in your head over your career are the things that you've heard from people. It's the negative comment. You'll read a performance review and there'll be 95% of it is really good and there's the 5% that's not. You don't remember anything but the 5%. I needed some sort of documentation that would become my smile file or the narrative that when I was having one of those moments of doubt, I could go back and read it. It was not something I would ever send out, but it was something that I could read and remind myself of accomplishments I'd forgotten about, projects I'd forgotten about, but also what gave me passion and purpose. There are certain projects that I knew I was in my sweet spot. I was where I was meant to be. I was working with people and we were making something very different. Those you sort of forget about, and you need a way to remind yourself.
Thank you so much for sharing other tips, other things that we all should do.
I would say one of my favorite quotes is, if your dreams don't scare you, they're just not big enough, right? And so if you're not facing these moments in your life or your career where you're uncomfortable, you're just not in that right place in terms of growth trajectory. And so when I reach those moments, I always just kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, I'm clearly learning and evolving right now. And that's what allows me to catch my breath, to just celebrate that it is a point where you're absolutely evolving as a person.
I'll give you another one. Turns this a little bit backwards, but I appropriated it's reminded me my grandmother's mantra, who always said, "In my service to others, I find a cure for my own ills." It's an old-fashioned statement. But if at the moment when you are feeling least powerful, if you will just stop thinking about yourself and reach out and go help someone else, reach behind you, help someone else, totally unrelated to your current issue, achieve something, there is nothing more empowering than doing that. It takes your mind off yourself or your doubts or your hesitations, and nothing's more powerful than a woman reaching out to someone else, another woman, a younger woman, a woman just starting out, a woman on the outside, and bringing her into the group. And it's amazing. It's just a change of course. So looking at yourself in the mirror and giving yourself a pep talk, but just getting out of yourself and helping someone else just really makes a difference.
First of all, fear is real, and it's crippling. And it does not allow you to be your most creative self. And when I started out, in fact, when things were just so bad, it was the moment when I thought, I better go get a job. But it was that moment when I said no. But as I was trying to figure out how to make this business work, I had to deal with that. And when I realized that as I was trying to figure out how to grow the company, how to scale, do these things, I remember that I was always challenged because, it's the self-doubt. I couldn't figure it out. And then when I realized that by simply learning, hey, fear, I'm going to put you in the corner for a moment, because it's real, but it will not let you be your best self. So when I pushed that aside and then I said, I'll get back to you, and then start thinking about how to grow the company. Yeah, at one point, I wasn't even sure how I could pay my rent. And so that corporate job looked really attractive, but it was the fear of everything. But the moment I moved that aside, I was able to start thinking about the various ways to move this business forward. Something else I did, and I will encourage this back to how we think. I used to get a rubber band and put on my wrist, back to how we think. And the moment I had a negative thought, I would pop it. I put myself on this 30-day positive thinking diet. I literally popped it if I heard a negative thought, and then I had to change that thought to something positive. And it was hard, too, because the moment you do one, I said I had to do it for 30 days straight, so I had to start all over. But after a while, you're training your mind. But it's really interesting, though, how, there are a few moments in my life that I really did start to see the change. And it was one when they stopped doubting the negativity. It says, I can, I will, I have faith. So I actually developed a band later in life that I would give to people because I did see that people would just be negative. Also, you have to be careful who you share your dreams with. We all have desires to be more in our careers or as entrepreneurs. But the reality is this, there are a lot of people will tell you what you can't do, and I encountered that. But here's what's important. They're really telling you what they can't do. Sadly, though, we want to believe everything that people tell us that we can't do, and it shuts us down. So this is also about whether mentor, sponsor, or just finding the right group of people who could help inspire you. Be very selective. Find the people who are going to encourage you. Find a way to just be positive, but it's really about understanding that we have an opportunity to be positive, and it could be within yourself or finding other people who will give you that positive energy.
And I'll tell you, I'll share one thing. Dee actually gives away those rubber bands to women who she mentors. I know 2 women who got the rubber bands, and they wear the rubber bands, and they snap it when they have negative thoughts. So she actually lives by it. One thing that I always say is that always remember that we see other people's outside, which is always very put together and brave, with our insides that might be crumbling. And they are seeing our outside with their insides. So don't assume that when you see somebody looking very confident that that person's inside is not actually crumbling more than yours. But then we do all that, right? All that work. And we go into a meeting. And this meeting usually has more men than women. And I'm going to give you 3 situations. And if you say you've never been in one of those, nobody will believe you. So the first one is you have something very thoughtful to say. You have a point of view. You have an opinion. And you spend minutes struggling. Should I say it? Should I not? Should I say it? Should I not? And then somebody else says it. And people are like, this is a great idea. And you think, that was my idea, damn it. That was not yours. But it wasn't, because you didn't say it. So that's number 1. Number 2 is you actually say something, and you are brutally shut off. Usually by guys, sorry guys, it is usually the way it is in the room. And the third one is, you say something, your boss doesn't pay too much attention, and then the guy says the same thing, and you're like, this is a great idea. So raise your hand if you've been in any one of those situations. What do you do? Okay.
In memory of a fabulous woman in Chicago who passed away a while back, Pastora San Juan Cafferty. She was the first woman on corporate boards. I think she was on Commonwealth Edison's board at the time. And we met in the ladies' room at the Chicago Club when there was only one ladies' room on the 3rd floor, and it was a big deal to be invited there. I guess you could be members back then. But we're in the ladies' room together. And she said, have you had it happen to you yet? We're standing there. And I said, what? She said, where you say something and it just goes into the air, and then about 5 minutes later, a man says it, and everybody says, yes, that's great. And you think, didn't I just say that? And I said, oh my God, thank you so much. I was beginning to wonder if my voice wasn't projecting, which is rarely a problem. And she said, that happens all the time in boardrooms. So I think it happens less now. But everybody's had that happen. You really have to own your ideas. And I have learned if someone doesn't comment on it and someone else wants to speak up, I'll say, wait, before you go on, does that make any sense at all that we should try and do it that way? Please pay attention. I think in the nicest way, women have to demand attention and have the self-confidence to see it and say it, which is what's going around these days, and demand attention to a response.
Well, I think you also have to advocate for yourself, but for others. So if you are in a room and there's another woman, you have to speak up when they say something to acknowledge that they've spoken. And for the men in the room, it is so critical for you to make that intentional. We were in a meeting earlier this week, a group of CEOs talking about what can we do to make an impact on this particular issue. And the one thing that somebody said was they looked around the room and they said, for you that are CEOs, that are men, you have to be intentional. You have to, when you're in the room, acknowledge that you heard something. You may not agree with it, but at least acknowledge that you heard it. So I would really encourage you to speak up, advocate for yourself, but make sure that you're reaching out to others as well.
Well, you can't always be nice. I mean,
Just repeat that. I'm not sure your mic was on.
You cannot always be nice. I mean, frankly, I think that's why sometimes we sit there and say nothing, and we're afraid that someone's going to perceive you as all those bad words we hear, but it's okay. I'm going to say thank you for thinking that, frankly. But I find that they are sitting there and, well, I'm not going to say this, but I was in a boardroom meeting, and there's a young lady there, and she, to your point, said something no one heard her. And then the guy next to her said that, and I says, oh, that was a great idea. Isn't that what she just said? Right. And then I asked her to say, would you explain more? And I put the spotlight on her to talk. I run into her into the ladies' room, and I said, listen, don't ever let anyone shut you down. And I said, the next time it happens, I'm going to say it again until you say something. But too often I will see people who also, men, will say things to women and shut them down in a heartbeat, and then they cower back. There's when a little fight is required because they're doing it intentionally, because they're actually trying to show that they're powerful. And too often I see women, particularly in the board environment, where they just sit there and they cower a little bit, or they're given a presentation when they come in to see us. Other executives come into the boardroom for presentations, and all the questions are directed to the men. You see, been there too. All the women there, and all of a sudden they start asking questions. And I learned to speak up. Oh, by the way, I'm over here. I'm going to also mention one thing too that happened in a boardroom, and this is why we are required to be there. Because they seem to think I'm the one that advocates the women and minority issues. In fact, my chairman in one case said, well, you're the expert. And I said, thank you, Chair. But I also said something in a meeting. I was talking about the issues of procurement because the numbers were low. And I said, everybody, you're seeing the same numbers I'm seeing, and your voice is just as strong. So I shouldn't be the only one talking about this matter. But the good news is I'm there, which is why women and minorities need to be there, because they're too often when issues of women in management, procurement, they don't get discussed. They seem to think that everything is actually better than it is. And if you don't acknowledge the problem, you can't really do much about it. And you'll see statistics that say that 20% of women participation. If I take out the administrative staff, and then look at what's really there, the numbers are low. But they're sitting there, management, thinking everything's okay. Well, it's not. And I feel it's my job to remind them that it's not, and that where the opportunities are. Sarah?
And I think what you said and also what Wendy said is so key, in that it can't just be like one person or one committee or one group. It's got to be the entire company and the entire culture. We partner with Amazon, and they have this brilliant promotion that they do where once a month everybody focuses on one thing. And one of the things they focused on was called manterruption. Sorry for our male members here, but manterruption in a meeting. And so it kind of gets back to what, Wendy said earlier, where it's like advocate for each other. So if somebody interrupts you, it's like somebody else says, whoa, let Wendy finish. She's got a great point. Or wait, don't interrupt John, because it happens to both men and women. Let John finish. Another month it's don't apologize. So don't say, oh, I'm sorry, I probably don't know as much as you, but I disagree. And they literally consciously go month by month with a different strategy of what everybody needs to focus on. And I think it gets back to what you said. It's got to be everybody, not just one person.
Absolutely. Terry?
You know, there's lots of times when it takes courage. Years back at an early McDonald's presentation, they were coming up with a strategic bookends and template or whatever was in vogue. And they had 5 management next level people reporting. And everybody listened to all the reports. This strategy was going to be headed by this person, this person. And it was the end of it. And I said, well, thank you, gentlemen. And there was silence. I said, and I notice you are all gentlemen. It's way back. I'm sure, I know it's changed over the years. But the points you make sometimes require bravery. And you have to be brave to speak up. And you have to be brave to speak up for yourself. You have to be brave to speak up for your point. You cannot blame yourself afterwards for not achieving something if you weren't your own best advocate. Mm-hmm. What's the worst that can happen if you speak up? They don't own your life. You'll move somewhere else where you can speak up. Speak up. It's, nowadays it has a sexual connotation, but it's about speaking up in favor of yourself. Is you take nothing away from this day for women. It's that you have every single right. Don't let anything that was ever drilled into you put you down. Speak up. When in doubt, just speak out.
Thank you. So I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask for Accenture's indulgence and forgiveness because I want to do a rapid fire with you, the 4 of you, before we wrap up. And so this is real quick. You can't, it's just boom. One piece of advice or request for the men in this room. We have this great opportunity. We have a quarter of this audience in this room, and God knows where else, what it looks like. One piece of advice. Sarah?
Seek that mentor and sponsorship role for leaders who are feminine and of color and, embrace D&I. Yep.
At the end of the day, write down, because Oprah did this, remember when she said, write something that makes you happy? At the end of the day, write down one thing you heard from a woman that you heard.
Dee.
Gentlemen, I know that you at times have thought about someone that you could help. And when we all go back to our offices, I hope that you think about the conversation you heard today and find just one way to help one other person, one woman, one minority within your firm, and be brave to say, I'm going to take this person and help them. They're struggling. They truly are. They are just hoping because they're not brave enough to come to you and ask for help. So I would just ask that someone, find someone that's performing. Just find one person and help them. Just reach out to them. Take them to lunch. Do one thing.
Randy?
The voice, while voices of women matter, it's expected for us to defend the rights and equality. It means so much more when that advocacy and that argument comes from men. And earlier this week, I actually had a chance to see Gretchen Carlson speak. And one of the comments that she made really resonated, which is that men don't need to man up, they need to speak up. So I would encourage you to use your voice because it will matter that much more.
So I think you all heard that. We're all going to be around for questions or comments for lunch, but I want to ask for a big round of applause for these 4 wonderful women. Thank you very much. Thank you.